phasing out gasoline cars and coal, what the COP26 climate summit, the UN climate talks have and have not achieved. As the United Nations Climate Summit in Glasgow, Scotland, finished, global leaders pointed to signs of real progress, but the Earth is still headed for dangerous levels of warming. And we know that there are, of course, increases in energy because certain countries are limiting coal production in Europe. Now, the points of these talks was for countries to announce ambitious carbon-cutting pledges that would prevent the world from warming more than 1.5 degrees Celsius or 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit above pre-industrial levels. And now we know that China alone is contributing to 27% of the Earth's pollution, Russia over 13%, and the next countries like US and India. But China did not attend the COP26 climate summit, neither did Russia. Now, these are the world's biggest producers of environmental pollution. Now, that did not happen, though, despite some new promises and old promises repackaged as new ones. An analysis by the independent group Climate Action Tracker found that with all the short-term pledges added together, the world is likely to heat up by 2.4 degrees. That's 4.3 degrees Fahrenheit this century. That's better than the path the world was on before the Paris Agreement 6 years ago, when scientists predicted nearly 4 degrees Celsius or 7.2 degrees Fahrenheit of warming. But the consequences would still be catastrophic. It would result in deadlier wildfires and floods, famine, and the extinction of more species, of course. The negotiations over what countries will do to combat climate change going forward are still ongoing. And this is the look at what's being accomplished so far and what has to be done because it remains unresolved. Side deals that were main event this time. This year's summit was unusual. Typically, the main event is the final agreement, painfully hammered out over 2 weeks of daily negotiations between representatives of nearly 200 countries. This time, most of the action happened on the sidelines. Kindly support my Patreon account. The daily posts are 5 videos daily, and they are totally different from what I have on my YouTube channel. Thank you so much for your support and that you find all my content so interesting. You'll find the Patreon account details in the description box. Nearly 100 countries joined a global pledge to limit emissions of methane, a planet-warming gas more potent as a polluter than carbon dioxide. Still more signed a pact to prevent further deforestation by the year 2030. A coalition of countries, cities, and automakers, including Ford, General Motors, Volvo, and Mercedes-Benz, committed to phase out sales of new fossil fuel vehicles by the year 2040 and by 2035 in leading markets. More than 40 countries pledged to phase out coal by the year 2030 and stop building coal-fired power plants, helping eliminate the larger source of planet-warming gases globally. Now, I don't know what's going to replace coal. Now, in a test of whether industrialized nations are capable of helping developing countries shift to cleaner sources of energy, South Africa reached a deal with the US, Britain, France, Germany, and the European Union, under which it would receive $8.5 billion over the next 5 years to transition away from coal. The US, Denmark, and other countries agreed to work towards zeroing out emissions from the shipping industry by 2050 and creating at least 6 zero-emission shipping routes. If these changes are enacted, governments could require, for example, that only emission-free ships travel from Shanghai to Los Angeles. There are reasons to be skeptical of many of these agreements, environmental advocates said. Brazil and Indonesia, countries that are destroying their forests, joined the deforestation pledge, and some of the world's largest coal-burning countries, including China, Australia, and India did not sign the pledge to phase out fossil fuels. Yeah, because how are they going to create their energy? We already know that China was trying to restrict coal burning, and the production there was diminished to 3 days a week. Now, going back to this, but the level of deal making at the summit is an enormous sign of success, said Sarah Ladislau, a managing director at the independent Colorado-based clean energy research organization, the Rocky Mountain Institute. More than ever before, she said, countries, industry, investors, and philanthropists are working together to reach side deals that could have a huge effect, adding that the conference should not be judged solely on whether something very big and new came out of the official negotiating process. Beyond swagger, what went down between the US and China? Doubts that the US and China, the top emitting countries in the world, were willing to work together on climate hung over the summit from the beginning. Chinese President Xi Jinping's absence led President Biden to publicly criticize him for skipping the summit, a scolding that prompted the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman to accuse the US of offering only empty words instead of concrete climate policies. Despite the rhetoric, American and Chinese officials had been working together for months. The countries unveiled a statement Wednesday in which they pledged to put aside their differences and raise ambition in the 2020s to address climate change. The deal itself mostly restated previous pledges, but the fact that the envoys of the two countries that together produce about 40% of global emissions could agree to even a vague goal was confidence building, said Kelly Sims Gallagher, professor of energy environmental policy at the Fletcher School at Tufts University. Gallagher said, "We're all in this really hyper-politicized environment, and the fact that this came together shows that they're trying to inject some momentum into the negotiations." What the US left on the table. America showed up, Biden said at the summit, where he touted the US's participation in the talks and apologized for former President Trump's exit from the Paris Agreement, which the country has since rejoined. He called on other nations to increase their climate goals, saying that we only have a brief window before us to raise our ambitions. But a couple of key moments, the US was noticeably absent. The White House did not join the pledge to phase out coal in the coming decades, even though coal's decline as a source of power in America has accelerated significantly. Nor did the US sign the agreement to phase out gas and diesel-powered cars, joining China and Japan in withholding its support from a deal that could have a greater influence if all the three, some of the largest car markets in the world, had backed it. Experts said the decision to abstain from these pledges spoke volumes about America's domestic politics and influence of the coal, oil, and gas industries. The American negotiators may also have been reluctant to antagonize Senator Joe Manchin III, a centrist Democrat from the coal state of West Virginia, whose support the president will need if his biggest climate policies are to win approval. The Democrat spending bill faces an uphill battle in Congress despite its pared-down measures. Youth climate activists made their case in the streets. Thousands of climate activists traveled to Glasgow to demand countries act faster to combat climate change. Many of them were young protesters, including Greta Thunberg of Sweden and Vanessa Nakate, activists from Uganda, who have achieved international recognition by publicly calling out world leaders for failing to take action and ignoring the demands of developing countries. Summit attendees said that COVID protocols made it more difficult this year for protesters to confront international leaders in person, but outside of the formal negotiations, side events, panel, and marches offered the activists a platform to make their displeasure known. They may have affected the proceedings' tone. There were boastful claims of progress, but these were often tempered by acknowledgments that the math does not add up, and more cuts will have to be made to keep global warming in check. Let me emphasize as strongly as I can, job not done, John Kerry, Biden's climate change envoy, said at the news conference last week, but this is doable if we follow through. What happens next? The summit inspired a flurry of new climate pledges from governments and industry. But in the weeks and months ahead, government officials and researchers will be watching closely to see whether they lead to concrete action. Biden's spending bill faces an uncertain future. A new Supreme Court case brought by West Virginia and other coal states could block the Environmental Protection Agency from regulating carbon pollution from power plants. And if Democrats lose their majority in Congress in the midterm elections, Biden would likely find his path to future emissions reductions blocked by Republicans. The report by Climate Action Tracker found that all of the pledges countries have made to get to zero emissions, only 4, Britain, Costa Rica, Chile, and the European Union, have detailed plans to achieve that. What's more, many of the major challenges that presented themselves at the beginning of the summit remained unresolved, including whether wealthy countries will come up to the $100 billion a year they previously promised to developing nations by 2020 to help them transition to cleaner sources of energy. Negotiations will likely continue at the upcoming World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland in January, as well as the next meeting of energy ministers from around the world in Pittsburgh in late 2022. We've got all these promises, we've got all these pledges, Ladislau said, but now we will see what countries are prepared to do. This is by Los Angeles Times Distributed Tribune Content Agency LLC on phys.org. By Anna M. Phillips, Los Angeles Times. Please leave your comments and thank you for your support.